Latina Leaders, I believe it was called. And as soon as she came in, she said, this is something that we have to do at FP. This is so important to do globally. I've just been focusing on it in Latin America. And I wasn't incredulous. I thought, okay, great, let's do it. She was so determined and so dogged and really, really wanted to get this going. I just want to ask you, why did you feel so passionate about bringing that to FP?
So you're putting me on the spot, Andrew. And I don't know if everyone can hear me. Sure.
Oh, sorry. Didn't realize your mic was off.
Yeah, so I mean, if you're here in the room or if you're tuning in, you know the statistics, right? There are so many untapped opportunities that we're missing because we're not including half of the world's population. So putting it simply, it really is the right thing to do. I knew that there would be enthusiasm and support for this type of programming, and you're here today, you're showing that. This program is 6 years strong, and it has only grown in support and interest from everywhere around the world. And it's opened up so many doors beyond the Her Power event. You know, we've done research projects on the links between having female leaders in the C-suite and executive positions and their company's, you know, performance, not just financially, but also from a sustainability standpoint and from so many other critical measures, openness, you know, how great a place it is to work. It's just been proven that if you have women at the table, things really do get better.
Hero.
And so, yes, and Hero, and this project that we've been hosting with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that I mentioned, it tells stories of women entrepreneurs from all over the world, the challenges they face, but the perseverance that they have to, you know, bring their vision to life and to be able to overcome those obstacles. And so, you know, I'm just very passionate about women's leadership, women's economic empowerment. I know you all are as well. And so just grateful for all of you being here and for the support, and hope to continue to grow this franchise.
Thank you, Diana. And I wanted to add also that we have a lot, it's not just Diana, we have a lot of incredibly brilliant, strong and successful women at foreign policy. And I would add, not to knock, I know I've got some of my male colleagues here as well, our partnerships team in this effort, our research teams, our events team, largely women. And I get asked often, like, what's with you, Andrew? You know, you only hire women. And the answer is, I do, because they're better. I'm not trying to be funny. They work harder. They have more to prove. They have great ideas. They're super driven. So I want to thank Diana. I'm getting choked up talking about this. I want to thank Diana. I want to thank all the amazing women that work at FP and that make it so great. We can wrap up now? Okay, how was that for a time kill, though? Not bad, right? Thank you, Diana. What are we doing now? I'm getting off the stage.
Please welcome to the stage Ditte Bjerregaard, Acting Tech Ambassador of Denmark, and Kelly T. Clements, Deputy High Commissioner of UNHCR, along with our moderator, Foreign Policy's Dr. Maisha Alam, for a conversation on closing the digital gender divide.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here with all of you, and thanks for everyone's patience as we were just getting a few wrinkles ironed, but I am delighted to have the opportunity to have this conversation with the Deputy High Commissioner and the Ambassador, Kelly Ditte. Thank you so much for joining us and taking time to have this conversation.
Thanks for the invite.
So we're going to have a really important discussion, which is about closing the digital divide when it comes to getting women and girls online. And as you'll see, we're going to be really talking about how that makes such a difference to social, economic, political development. And so, Kelly, I'd love to go straight to you and start with asking, you know, how does the digital gender divide affect forcibly displaced women and girls? And what are the most significant barriers to ensuring that they have access to digital technologies at a time when there are more people forcibly displaced around the world than ever before in modern history?
Thank you. Thanks so much, Manisha. There is a huge room outside with lots of more people. I think we need a bigger space next year. There's a lot of interest. Thanks for coming, and UNHCR is very pleased to be with you this afternoon. No, a couple of things, and you mentioned it. I mean, we're talking about today a situation where we have more people forced to flee than ever before. 120 million people across the globe. Some hotspots that have just sparked. Some have re-sparked. If you look at, for example, what's happening in Sudan, if you look at the tragedy that is the Middle East now, if you go further to Asia and you look at Myanmar, that's little talked about. These are all scenarios where we're talking about populations that are moving and moving quickly. Some are leaving with almost nothing. Some have a few things with them. But just like digital technology is changing the face of basically everything that we do, the same thing is happening now with humanitarian aid and the way that we're trying to both deliver assistance and protection, finding solutions, but also thinking about the people that are moving. And it's the vast majority of the people that we serve with many partners around the globe are women and families. Look at Ukraine. Vast majority were women coming with their children to neighboring countries, those that left. Many more displaced inside Ukraine. So what we have found, and we have some incredible partnerships in the digital space, including with big players like GSMA, helped us to do some research to say, do refugees, do those that are internally displaced, do they have the access, both in terms of internet capability, the mobile devices, the ability to do the know your customer, all of these things that we take for granted. How can we extend that to women and girls, even in situations of forced displacement? And we're looking very strongly, for example, at issues related to connectivity. And when it comes to connectivity, we have a scenario where we have seen that women are, for example, in context, we did some studies in the Syria situation, where women were 80% less had less access, for example, to mobile devices, to ways to be able to use their money differently, these sorts of things. And so as we design programs, as we think about how we extend protection and aid, we have to think very clearly with a gender lens. And I'll come to that a little bit about how we do that. Perhaps I have an opportunity.
Absolutely, no,
answer.
definitely.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that you emphasized that I just want to underscore is women and children make the majority of the world's displaced population, and increasingly the period of displacement is longer and longer. And so when we think about closing the digital divide, it's so important, not just in the immediate moment as they're seeking safety and shelter and access to humanitarian resources, as you said, but considering that they may be in that displaced position for a long time. And the other thing that you said that I think is really important to underscore is about partnerships, and that it takes a real ecosystem, if you will, of stakeholders. And so, Ditte, I'd love to bring you in on this a little bit. Tell us a little bit about how Denmark's Tech Diplomacy Office has worked to address the gender digital divide, and what are some examples of policies or partnerships that you've been able to initiate that have made a difference?
Thank you very much. Before I jump to our tech diplomacy, maybe let me say that I started actually as a humanitarian for the UNHCR in Afghanistan. At that time, the world was not so connected as today. But just to say that there is no moment, or no place where the trust in information is more important than in situations of crisis, of conflict, of people having to flee. So not just the connectivity, but also the content, that it's a safe space where you can find the right information, there's no disinformation, where you know where to go, where you know how to get the support from the UNHCR that is needed in a trusted and human rights respecting way. So just by saying that, this is reality, this is the real reality we need to address. And then moving to our tech diplomacy, it was a very novel thing. We started in Denmark. I think we appointed the first tech ambassador back in 2017. Today we all know the huge impact of the tech business in our lives, our economy, gender issues, our politics, foreign policy. But back in those days it was not so normal. So not only did we appoint an ambassador, we also decided that this ambassador and diplomatic staff should be placed in Silicon Valley and having a diplomatic dialogue directly with the industry. And this is where you can say what is reality for our societies in refugee situations. We wanted to bring that directly to the ones who have such big impact on it in a more structured way. So connecting, real life challenges with the companies who make the algorithms that affects us in so many ways have been really the raison d'etre of our engagement that has evolved since then. And of course, also the question on the gender divide is a very important part that we bring to the table. And I think what we do is, of course, try first of all to underline the responsibility for the products, how they affect not only US or Europe, but in all over the world. And also very much insisting on the need for this multi-stakeholder approach, where we bring different type of actors together, civil society, politician, and the tech industry for action and joint action. So it's both convening and it's translation, but it's also trying to create action on a human rights respecting technological development. And when coming from all of these days here, where you really can see there's a lot of focus not only on the hype and doom of AI, but maybe more, there's more talk about real solutions, how they can contribute. And this is really, really positive. I think with the Global Digital Compact, now we have a global consensus. Now we have to deliver. But the more of the SDGs we want to deliver through technology, the more important it becomes that there's no, the structures underneath, that it doesn't exacerbate the digital divide. Yeah. And also, of course, you have, this is on a very structural level, that we all the time have to think about this in the way the tech industry design and develop and deliver solutions. And this is what we kind of try to help bring to the table, and being a translator and a convener for some of these issues. And then, of course, specifically, we also have these very serious discussions on the online harm and harassment that's here now, and that also has to be brought to the table, and where it's very important for us to connect the testimonies and the women and the experiences they have more directly with the industry and help that dialogue.
I love that, and I really appreciate what you said about kind of taking innovative approaches to Silicon Valley and engaging directly with, and also, the ways in which emerging technologies may both intentionally but inadvertently have gendered impacts that only further exacerbate inequalities. I'd love to shift the focus a little bit and talk about solutions that are working or that are making a difference. And Kelly, in particular, are there any examples of innovative work that UNHCR has been involved with partners in terms of trying to close that gender digital divide? And what have you seen to be the impact when it comes to, for example, women's security, their economic empowerment, the opportunities that they're able to avail while they are displaced?
Well, there are a couple of things that I wanted to pick up with what Dita mentioned, because I think when we talk about it, and you said it earlier, it is really about partnerships. And while tech can be used for good, and that's what we want it to be used for, it can also be used in ways that do harm to the people that we're working with and for. And so this issue, and Dita just mentioned this, we're very, very concerned as we're going into this. How could we use tech, for example, to ensure that the amount of misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, we're in a, everybody in this room I know knows that half the planet is voting. When we talk about refugees and asylum seekers and migrants, unfortunately they become not the symptom of what's going wrong, but that somehow they are responsible for it, which of course is nothing. It's a scapegoat. And then you're dealing with a situation, and when we're talking about these areas, and some of them very remote, not connected, The gender norms, the cultural norms are not such that you would automatically think, let's bring the entire community, let's include all, including women and girls, into the same sort of opportunities that we might provide for men and boys. And so partnerships becomes the key way to deliver. And I think this is probably the biggest thing that we've seen over the last few years is our drive to bring the decision-making to those communities that are impacted so that they are designing the programs, they are the ones that are putting into place training, skilling, that they are the ones that are saying this is what we need and this is how we're going to deliver it. We have undertaken a huge, and not to use too much of the humanitarian jargon, but we call it localization, where, so you don't have a big organization like UNHCR, a big INGO, International Non-Governmental Organization, that is the one that's delivering. They're community-based organizations, they're women-led organizations, they're refugee-led organizations. And so we've done things like, for example, an innovative digital fund, where we are actually providing resources directly to those community-based organizations that do the skilling themselves. So they are the ones then that will do the outreach to women, to those to say, come in, we want to be able to provide a coding class or to do something a little bit differently, or women entrepreneurs that need to have that kind of connection to be able to have then a bank account, to be able then to put the resources that they make from selling their goods online, for example. All of this so that we don't do it directly. And we've got several examples where we've done this quite successfully in terms of this in various parts of the world, which we think we can basically scale up, because that's the goal, right? You find something that works locally and then you replicate it over and over and over again. And now what we're finding is, obviously the digital space provides an incredibly powerful way for people to get information fast. You want it to be safe information, but this is the key, obviously, to service provision. If somebody is moving, where do they find, for example, a place to be able to get their kids some health care, or to be able to find, as you saw in the Ukraine outflow, where can people go for a safe place to sleep? We'll take that another step further. It becomes incredibly powerful, and we've done this in several situations, and our goal is now, working with partners, how can we provide a digital space where you match people with economic opportunities? So that's the next step for us. Now we're doing this with the private sector, we're doing it with other UN partners, we're doing it importantly with those local communities, but the digital agenda, let me put it that way, Dita just mentioned the compact. This makes all of that possible to really scale it up in a major way and leave nobody behind.
Well, and I love that point about localization also, because it really instills a paradigm shift. They're no longer just beneficiaries of programs. They're agents of change, and they're also at the front line, if you will, of changing their futures, right? We're almost out of time, but I want to ask both of you one closing question, which is, we're here on the sidelines of UNGA. The Summit of the Future is happening. 2025 marks 30 years since the Beijing conference. There's a lot of really important anniversaries that are being commemorated soon, and at this time, specifically this week, with the Summit of the Future. So my question is, how do we keep gender equality, and especially in the digital age, in the age of AI, on the policy agenda, and not just on the margins, but at the top of the policy agenda? So I'm going to, Dita, ask you that first, and then Kelly, give you the last word.
Yeah. To be honest, I think it's, I can see in Denmark that it has really moved to the top of the agenda, because the harassment and the online abuse, the deepfakes, it's really exploding. So we have to take that reality and, act on it. So this is on the harassment side, and we support it in many different ways. There are structures, there are, you have the DDC, the UN, the EU, global forums where we bring it to the table, of course, but then there's also the more invisible part of it, where we all have responsibility, and this is where we will continue to connect the local reality that, many civil societies, organizations, they bring to the table directly with the tech industry and insist in this dialogue. Right here at UNGA, we have supported what's called perth.org, who's a platform for testimonies of women who have experienced abuse, online abuse. This is one way. We'll continue supporting organizations who work with the benchmarking, the tech companies, also in this the gender area. Bring that to the table. We will help facilitate whenever anyone comes to Silicon Valley, be it you, Kelly, or OHR, in insisting that we have to have this dialogue and help translating it, so it becomes tangible and not something only used in beautiful documents.
Great.
All of you keep the pressure on. Really, I don't know how many heard the Secretary General this morning. His remarks were embedded with gender equity, gender equality, the fact with what's happening around the world where women's rights seem to be slipping through our fingers faster than we can somehow close that gap. It's only through political pressure and continued advocacy that we're going to really see change. And I'm going to say one thing. I see 0-0, so I know you want to wrap up.
Okay.
But we've just launched something within the UN. It's going to sound a little process heavy, but it's called the Gender Acceleration Plan. And this is basically having gender equality go throughout the system, from everything from hiring practices to the way that we learn, to the way that we make sure that we have women at the policy and political tables with us, making the decisions that affect their choices and so on. All of that's going to be super important. And unless you do a whole of system approach, you don't see the change that you need.
And change from within, no
That's
less.
Exactly.
Well, to both of you, Kelly and to Ditta, thank you so much again for being here for this conversation, and we wish you all the best this week as you have more important discussions.
Please welcome President Tarja Halonen, the former President of the Republic of Finland, for a conversation on breaking down barriers with foreign policy's Andrew Solinger.
What an audience. I mean that they have been sitting here how many hours already with different... Okay.
Actually, not that long, but they've been very patient with the ins and outs.
Okay.
We're so happy to have you here. And I want to clarify something also about President Halonen. We were waiting for her earlier, but that's because we shifted her earlier. She's not late. She's exactly on time. I just want to clarify that. So we're all clear. If we were the ones who were off on that one. President Halonen, thank you so much for joining us here at Her Power. You may have heard some of the comments that were just made. This is an incredibly important moment for gender rights globally, especially as we talk about them around the UN. And you have an incredible perspective from your history and where you have been and where you've served. You were the first female president in Finland's history.
So far.
So far. Elected 20 years ago-ish, more, 24?
I started 2000, and then we have a 6 years period, and 2 times is possible, so I made 12 years. And before that, I was 5 years foreign minister to my predecessor, Matti Ahtisaari, and then I have been in Minister of Justice, Minister of Social Welfare, 20 years in the Parliament, and I started in 1969 as a student radical, so I'm old.
You were young at heart, and we thank in spirit. A long history of public service. Interestingly, the most recent Finnish Prime Minister, Sanna Marin, is the youngest Prime Minister who has ever served in that office, and her top cabinet officials
and you will have a possibility to listen her on Saturday in the Central Park. They have some big citizens
Award event.
yeah, or something like that. Yeah. So,
Well, we will look for her there.
but I think it was sold out. But sometimes sold out doesn't mean that you don't get the tickets. Okay.
We'll talk to the president afterwards if we need tickets. I have a feeling she might have access. Interestingly, Prime Minister Marin's top cabinet officials were also all women. What do you think?
Yeah, and so now my husband will say that you behave like at home, but anyway, so we have a coalition government. It's very typical in Finland, and Sanna Marin's government was also a coalition government. It was consisting 5 different political parties, and every one of them had a lady in the as a lead.
Outstanding. So tell us what you think that track record of female leadership in government in Finland says to other countries who have yet to meet that milestone so far, like the United States.
Yes, so far. Yeah, good. I love such kind of optimistic men. No, it was a very good time. Of course, it's according my own political background. I think that in USA I would be Democrat. I say it openly. And so in that way, I think that everything went very well. It was a time of COVID-19, and which made it very difficult. Somebody could say even that COVID-19 had, if you see that there was any benefits, it was that people understood quite quickly that we must have some kind of the consensus. We have to understand that how to behave, and I think we did it a bit better than what you made in USA, because in Finland we have
a low bar.
We had in Finland the good situation that scientists, even they have a different kind of opinions. In the publicity, they said that this system could be this good side and that bad side, and that always the experts, if any of you is scientists, always tell to those who should make a decision that all systems have a good side and bad side, and then it's a politicians to choose which are the good sides and bad sides, because there is not such kind of system which is without any negative side. Yeah.
Interesting. I bet you don't think about this a lot, and I understand now for 2 6-year terms. You served for 12 years as head of state. Do you know where you rank in terms of length of service and tenure with democratically elected heads of state that were women?
Quite good, I think.
Yeah, quite good. Let me tell you where you rank. By my math, number 5, after Vigdis Finnbogadóttir of Iceland, who was the first democratically
and now
elected.
I do. Okay, Icelanders are always doing it well.
16 years she was head of Iceland. And then number 2, maybe we could do this as an interactive. Angela Merkel of Germany.
Yeah.
Also 16 years.
She was a good one. Yeah, okay. After all mistakes, but she was good. Yeah.
We're not going to hand out grades, but I'll agree with you. Number 3 is a little tougher. That's Eugenia Charles of Dominica, 14 years.
Yeah.
And then number 4, the great Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, we know
6
each other. Yeah, we after the war in Liberia was over, so she wanted to organize a very good international meeting to tell that we have now the peace. And I was the guest of honor there because we have helped them. And then the interesting thing was that the how could I say, the places were in terrible condition. And when I went there and then I said that looks quite bad. So even it's now peace. So she said, okay, but let's wait for tomorrow. Our women will even clean the streets. And they did it. They put all this as much as they could. They were really preparing like a family congress in such a way. And everybody should see that now this is a new system. And so, yeah, she was great.
Great. So then there's you, number 5. Do you know who you beat out as number 6 and 7?
No.
Margaret Thatcher.
Yep. Yeah.
And Indira Gandhi.
Oh, no, yeah.
So that's some good company.
But my end was better than
You're
with Indira, yes. So far.
We're not going to go there. That's good company, but I want to ask what understanding the length of your term also, and this doesn't have to do really with gender at all, the importance of term length and and continuity in effective leadership. We switch here in the United States, it's just a constant election cycle. And then in some parliamentary systems, it makes our term lengths in the U.S. seem like epics.
Yeah.
Do we need to fix that? Do term lengths need to be longer?
So I already told beforehand to you that I happened to be here in USA, in Boston, at Harvard University. I was already retired, and so I remember when I was asked to study also the Obamacare and then also the situation with Hillary. We were not at all the similar. I think that the Boston people said that Elizabeth Warren could be the more like me, but then we tried to, how could I say, to discuss that what could be useful and not. And so your political system is totally different. We have direct elections, so the people vote directly the candidates. We had in the time 2000 when I was candidating. So thanks for already the predecessor. So when my predecessor, Mike got the Nobel laureate in peace. So in final discussions, he was against Elizabeth Rehn, a lady, our first Minister of Defense, female one. And so in that time already we could feel that women are, and also part of the men are ready to vote a woman. And then 2000 we had, if I remember correctly, 6 female candidates and 1 man. And then in final route, so we had this man and me. And I was a foreign minister. I was very well trained in that way. So I think that we cannot compare the systems. For me, USA is something between the state and EU in such a way that you have a federal states and you have a lot of power also in your states. When we are large country, small population, and direct election. So I don't try to give any advice.
We're going to ask you for advice, so I hope you'll change your mind. Finland continues to be one of the top countries to have closed a remarkable percentage of its gender gap, according to the annual World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Report. What in Finland? What is there still left to be done? And what, even though you're not in the business of giving advice, what can we learn from your example, from Finland's example, and bring that to other countries, other regions?
So the first thing to make the people vote. That voting is something. It's like a human rights that you cannot give it to somebody else. You have to do it by yourself. And one thing what is very typical for us, for women, is we have learned that whatever we do, also some men, I see there, at home, it means that you do the same things every bloody day, and then you have to start it again, whether it's cleaning, food, or something else. And I think that in politics, this is a little bit the same, that even you think that you have done already a lot of reforms, and then 5 years, 10 years, and then you have to try to again, at least to defend the reforms, and then you have to do it again. And that's why I think that what you can learn is to be stubborn. In Finnish, we have a Finnish word which is sisu. Sisu means that you try even to go through the grey stone if it's needed. And so I mean that you cannot get everything ready-made. You have to work hard to do it. And then when you get it, you repeat it.
We like to... I think that is an applause note.
Okay, I know we have...
We're at 0 right now. Something's wrong with this clock. It's broken. the last thing I always want to leave with, but especially with you.
I have time for you. My next
All right.
my next place is after 1 hour, 1.5. Yeah.
So last, I don't think MasterCard would be too happy about that. Let's go. One last question then.
Okay.
To end on an optimistic note, you've seen a lot over your time. You have the benefit of and as foreign minister, I hope an FP reader, have seen some bad stuff. Unfortunately, we seem to be at a very horrible inflection point in the world right now. What gives you hope that we can work our way through this?
Difficult to say. We just made in Finland a book together with a younger journalist, and she said that when she started, she thought that I could give such kind of way of optimism, what I seem to have. And I said that I'm every morning very optimistic. In the evenings it's more difficult. And so so when she had to study what was from 2000 to 2012, what was my time to being president. So she was astonished, and she said that I didn't understand that it was so difficult time, so much chaotic situation. We have the war against the terrorism, and we had all this. You remember the Twin Towers and everything, and then we started in Afghanistan. It was also I have been in politics when it was the Iraqi war and all that. So I said that, yeah, afterwards you always think that things are very logical and easy to see what you should do the next. But when you are living it, it's very difficult because you don't know the future. And so I think that the worst thing what is happening now, when you ask that what's the worst, I think that earlier the Red Cross was the symbol that don't attack. In the old days we said that hurting women or children was the worst thing to do. Today, both the United Nations and its civil servants or Red Cross or other same organizations, they seem to be more targets. Nobody tries to avoid that, but we get the civilian victims. Of course, we understand that there might be, and it has been an old system, and that also the systems are internet in such a way
layered,
that it's very difficult to divide the civil and military. But nowadays it seems to be even worse. And that's why I'm very happy that both European Union and USA, we are trying to stop these terrible things. Then other thing what was a shock for us, for Europeans, has been, of course, the Russians' war in Ukraine. Because we thought that we Europeans, we are already so developed that there will not be an old-fashioned war in our continent. And as you know, it was a mistake. And so that's it, what we have to study and learn. Now it's perhaps too close yet, that's what was wrong. And we, as a neighboring country for Russia, so,
and now a member of NATO.
Yeah, and also Sweden.
Yeah.
And Sweden, which has been 200 years without war and was strongly against the military networking in that way. Now they are also in NATO.
Yeah. So if we had more of your wisdom still in government, perhaps we would not be in this mess. But we thank you so much for sharing your insights and for coming and sharing.
Be optimistic, at least in the mornings. Okay.
President Hallinen.
Yeah. That's it.
And now, turn your attention to the screens for a short video titled, Good Vision Changes Everything. Service as a Catalyst.
இப்போ நாங்கள் இருக்கிற பகுதி பார்த்திங்கன்னா ஃபுல்லாகவே கிராமத்து பகுதி. இந்த இடத்துல என்னால் முடிஞ்ச ஒரு உதவியாக எல்லாருக்குமே கண் வந்து செக் பண்ணி கண்ணாடி கொடுக்க முடியும். என்னால் முடிஞ்ச ஒரு உதவியாக நான் அது பண்ணுவேன். கண்டிப்பாக வந்து நிறைய ஷாப் ஓப்பன் பண்ணி ஸ்பெக்டிக்கல் வந்து எல்லாருக்கும் கொடுப்பேன்.
We realized pretty early on that the only way that we can solve the problem of uncorrected refractive error is by creating permanent access points in rural communities, where we can train community members to act as vision care providers to their community members.
ஐ கனெக்ட் டெக்னீஷியன் கோர்ஸ் முடிச்ச உடனே எனக்கு ஆப்டிக்கல் ஷாப் வந்து வச்சுருக்கேன். இந்த ஆப்டிக்கல் ஷாப் மூலிமா வர வருமானத்து மூலிமா வந்து எங்கள் அம்மாவோட ஹெல்த் இஷ்யூஸ் அண்ட் எங்கள் அப்பாவால் சம்பாரிச்சு கொடுக்க முடியாதுன்றதால எங்கள் ஃபேமிலியை நான் தான் பார்த்துக்கிறேன். எனக்கு பார்த்திங்கன்னா இப்போ 20 தான் வந்து நடந்துட்டு இருக்க ஏஜ். இந்த வயசுலேயே வந்து நான் ஒரு பிஸ்னஸ் ஸ்டார்ட் பண்ணுறேன்றது எனக்கு ரொம்ப சந்தோஷமாக இருக்குது.
We believe that it is our responsibility to bring as many women into the mainstream of economic activity and social contributions as we can.
இந்த ப்ரோக்ராம் கருத்துக்கு முன்னாடி வந்துட்டு கொஞ்சம் கஷ்டமாக தான், டே பை டே நானும் 4 செவத்துக்குள்ளே தான் பார்த்துட்ருக்கணும். இந்த ப்ரோக்ராம் வந்துட்டு எனக்கு ரொம்பவே உதவியாக இருந்துச்சு, நல்லா இருந்துச்சு. அதுக்கேற்ற மாதிரி நானும் இப்போ நெக்ஸ்ட்டு கடை வைக்கலான்னு சொல்லிட்டு பார்த்துட்ருக்கோம், நானும் எங்கள் ஹஸ்பண்டும். நம்மளுக்கான ஒரு அடையாளத்தை நம்ம எப்போவுமே உருவாக்கணும்னு நினைப்போம். அந்த மாதிரி தான் நான் நினச்சேன். அந்த மாதிரி தான் இந்த ப்ரோக்ராம் வந்தால் அந்த மாதிரி அதுக்கு எனக்கு ஏற்ற மாதிரி ஒன்று அமைஞ்சிருக்கு. அதை நான் உதவியாக எடுத்துக்கிட்டு அதை ஒரு நல்லபடியாக நான் பண்ணிவிட்டு வெளியே வரணும்னு நான் நினைக்கிறேன்.
We hope that all of these stories will serve as an inspiration to strike that spark of resilience and eventual success through sheer perseverance that these women have shown us. It inspires not only fellow women, but inspires whole communities and in turn the whole world.
Please welcome Irene Atuhaire, Uganda Country Director for Seed Global Health, Payal Dalal, Executive Vice President of Global Programs at MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, and Becky Palm, Vice President and Executive Director at the One Site Essilor Lexicata Foundation, for a discussion on advancing health and financial inclusion.
Hi, everyone, and hello again. I'm sure all of you were moved and inspired by the incredible short film that we just saw, and I'm so honored to have this conversation with such a diverse and illustrious panel and talk about why vision care for women and led by women is so important, not just for health, but also for economic well-being and for communities to grow and prosper. And for me, as somebody who is visually impaired and always dependent on eyeglasses or contact lenses, it strikes close to home, and I'm sure for many of you in the room and watching online, that probably strikes close to home as well. So let's dive right in. And Becky, I'd love to start with you. You are, of course, helping lead the charge for much of the work, including the program that we were just seeing on that video. And so let me ask you this, how does One Site Essilor Luxottica, your foundation, how does it leverage community-led involvement to address both the lack of awareness when it comes to vision care, but also empower women to be the change makers within their communities? How do you do that?
Sure. Well, just starting with the why. Good vision does change everything. 1 in 3 people around the world can't see clearly. If you look to your left and to your right, anywhere around the world, someone can't see. And 746 million women. It has a disproportionate amount of women that cannot see. And so really that alone is a big piece of it. And gender inequity and socioeconomic challenges are a big piece of that. And we know that the SDGs, many of them are tied to vision. And we've also at the foundation tied 19 different pathways, not just tied to health, that really are connected to what we do. So for us in our programming, we think about simultaneously looking at bridging the vision care gap and also those gender inequities in the way we work. So the video that you saw was one of our recent programs. We actually started some of our entrepreneurial programs back in 2013 in India, among other places. But that program, working in rural environments, and the 2-pager you have on your seats talks about some of this in more detail, but those rural communities, finding points where we could bring vision to places that need it most, and finding ways to do that and incorporating women. In these communities, by incorporating women, they are oftentimes the center of the households. They're the center of communities. And you, as you were watching, you perhaps saw that they were like starting businesses at 20 or coming out of depression or finding where they were getting their livelihoods. And so by creating these entrepreneurial programs, they can create a livelihood for the first time or never thought they could, and bringing in an income for their families. But in that same time, creating that awareness organically within family to family and then broader communities, and also meeting them where they're at. By meeting them where they're at, they don't have to travel to an urban area to receive care, and that's a big piece of that. And at this point, we've put 30,000 different access points and growing to try and make sure that's sustainable. To date, our programs are 60% women. Our last class was all women. The idea being that we want to make the programs flexible and obtainable for them so that they can see clearly. So for us, we see that as a scalable model, a really easy scalable model, but also where we can see it really soaring as far as bridging that vision care gap and also addressing the gender inequity.
Yeah, there's so much in what you said that resonates with me, and we're going to have a chance to pick up on a few of the threads, but a couple of points in particular. I appreciated what you said about vision care being many ways cross-cutting across the SDGs. If you really want to achieve just about any of the SDGs, you need to close that vision care gap and particularly understand the disproportionate impacts on women. The other thing that you said that I think is so important is that we need to realize that it's not just about health. And as you mentioned, for those of you that are in the room, you might have seen FP Analytics, the Independent Research Division of Foreign Policy, the team which I lead, has just put out a short study looking at what difference the returns on investment are when it comes to vision care. And certainly you can measure that at a micro level and a macro level in terms of economic returns. But one of the things that we discovered through our research and engaging with all of you is just what a difference it makes in terms of the human return on investment and the confidence that is gained and the sense of social belonging and being able to live a fuller life, not things that can be easily quantified. So I encourage anyone who's interested in this issue to please take a look, and if you're online, the digital version is available online too. But the other thing that you said was the importance of community-led and community-rooted initiatives. And Irene, you are a force of nature. You lead Seed Health's work in Uganda. And I'd love to bring you in on this because, I can't think of anyone better placed to talk about community-rooted, community-led healthcare. And so help us all understand a little bit. What are the unique challenges faced by local healthcare workers, and in particular women who often are a major part of the local or community-based healthcare workforce when it comes to delivering care? And how do you support locally led women's initiatives to be able to grow and scale, as Becky was saying?
Thank you so much for that question. So a number of challenges affect health workers, but because we have 70% of health workers as women, the impact is bigger on women. So the first challenge I can think of is burnout. We know we are having so many diseases. We are having epidemics after epidemics. Right now we have mpox, we have malaria and so many other diseases. So the burden is high. And for women, for example, from a country where I come from, is that women are the primary caregivers. So the woman is the caregiver at home, and then she also has to come back and give care to the community. So that's the first. So burnout really affects the women more than the men, in my perspective. The other challenge, of course, is pay and lack of promotion opportunities. We all know that generally health workers are not paid as well. I know even in the US it's the same. In most of our countries, really health workers are not paid as well. But you find that for women, let's say if I was to have a job, I may be paid less than my colleague. And it's worse in countries which are more patriarchal. So I would say that the pay gap and the economic aspects really affect women health workers more. The other is representation. So Uganda has made a lot of progress. All our ministers of health, the 3, are women. But you know that ministers are more at representation level. Sometimes you have that middle group that makes the decisions or helps the minister to make the decision. So you find that most are men. When you come now to the grassroots, the people who do the work, the bigger part of those are women. So the women are more at the base where we are doing the work, but when it comes to representation, leadership, we are a smaller proportion. The other aspect that is very dear to my heart is harassment, sexual harassment, abuse. It is, the first panel talked about it, but for women in the healthcare setting, it's even worse. You find that a woman may be placed to work on night shift. In this time, she's not safe. When she's coming from her home to the health facility or to wherever she's going, she's not safe. In the environment that she's working in the hospital, she may not be safe. Then the stereotypes and discrimination are also higher on women. So you see that the woman, while they're doing all the work, the challenges that health workers face are really bigger on the women. And how we support as Seed Global Health, we've done training to ensure that, of course, they are skilled, they have the tools that they need, but the bigger part is empowering women, empowering health workers to speak up through associations, not to be afraid to speak up and let the decision makers know what they need, what the challenges are. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to come back to the healthcare point, the training and scaling point in a little bit. I appreciate what you said about the reality at the grassroots level. And if we go from the grassroots to the global, MasterCard is one of the largest and important companies in the world when it comes to everything from financing and tech and so much more. But MasterCard for a long time now has also been really focused on how to generate inclusive growth and to do so in ways that are sustainable and uplift communities, Payal. And so I'd love to talk to you a little bit about the work that you are doing, and specifically as relates to Strive Women and how initiatives such as Strive Women support women entrepreneurs that are in underserved regions. Can you help everyone understand why is financial inclusion so important when it comes to economic empowerment, health and well-being, and even, what is the main point of this conversation, vision care?
A lot of questions there. Thank you, Maisha. Let me start with where you left off, which is the intersection of financial inclusion, healthcare, vision care. I think the truth of the matter is none of these challenges operate in isolation. They're all intrinsically linked. So if we pick up on the thread that Irene was talking about around gender-based violence, a lot of the work that we've done, Maisha, has shown that actually if you digitalize the wages of underserved workers, gender-based violence goes down because they're not carrying cash, right? And so how do you bring all of these pieces together? If we think about healthcare and vision care, so many women entrepreneurs are operating in that field. So I think the first point I'd make is just there's such intersectionality across all of these topics. And ultimately it boils down to we want women to have equal access. We want them to have opportunity. We want them to have agency. And frankly, we want to stop putting all the burden on her shoulders. So how do we do that? So that's where I'll start, intersectionality. And then in terms of kind of your first question, some of the things that we do, we're very focused on underserved women in supply chains. So we do a lot of work with garment workers in supply chains. And we also do a lot of work with women-led and owned micro and small businesses. And again, it boils down to opportunity and economic power. In so many contexts that we operate in, women might not have all of the options available to them. So what is the tool set that we can give them, and what's the opportunity set we can give them to be able to chart their own paths and be able to support themselves and their families and their communities? And so I'm happy to talk in more detail about these programs, but I think I was told to keep it short, so I will.
Well, not to worry, we'll come back to you, but I think, one of the things that you were emphasizing is that it's not only one intervention or one thing that's a magic bullet, right? That you need to take an intersectional approach, and one that really understands the connections between different barriers and challenges. Becky, you touched on this. Irene, you touched on this. And the other thing that all three of you touched on that I think is so important is scaling up, right? When we figure out what's working and what's working well, how do we scale that up and make it contextually relevant elsewhere? And so, Becky, I'd love to come back to you on this, which is, you know, you have these really promising and productive initiatives like iRafiki, like iMitra, and at the foundation, how are you prioritizing scaling when it comes to training and development, and to make sure that not only can these grow, but be sustained over time?
Sure. Well, I just want to call out the comment about the burden, and just the idea is we want to be able to uplift, and how are we doing that and simplifying it? So it's great into that question, and that, you know, one of the ways, as we have been doing some of our entrepreneurial programs for over a decade, is learning about how we are doing our trainings to make sure that we're emphasizing and being as inclusive as possible to encourage more women to participate. And one of the key things we're doing is creating hybrid and more truncated training models, where now it's a 2-week training model, but it's part physical, part digital, and really making that flexible. During a visit about over 5 years ago, when there was just a minority of women participating, it was all physical, and it was a more than 2-week process. When I talked to them, they're like, well, I had to coordinate and have someone watch my children, and some of the household responsibilities had to be reallocated, and it made it more difficult. That burden was there. So I think that really speaks to why we have seen such a rise, and it's so important. We're working with rural healthcare workers as well, and trying to leverage those skills and build that confidence even more if they're already in the general health arena, perhaps not touching on vision, of building that into it. So again, increasing that confidence, lifting that burden a little bit more, and also allowing them to refer services out and actually perhaps get even a little bit more income, and creating, again, that broader circle of care and community. But we're not trying to do that alone. I think when you talk about scale, partners are critical. Partners are critical not just for the lift, but really because of the community component. When you go into a new place, a friendly introduction is always welcomed, but also that knowledge and expertise. So understanding what's going to work in a community, also how to identify, especially women that would be interested. If you saw those that were on the video, perhaps they didn't have the confidence to raise their hand, but how do we encourage and get more women to be involved? So those are just some examples in terms of how we're trying to create that scale.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And of course, it's not easy to do, and it takes a village, so to speak, right? And the kind of maybe most important word that you highlighted is partnerships. And so, Payal, I'd like to come back to you on this a little bit. And in particular, you know, as you do the work that you're leading at MasterCard, tell us a little bit about how partnerships between the private sector and philanthropic organizations or other stakeholders, civil society organizations, how can they help scale initiatives and not only help them be replicated in multiple contexts, but be contextually relevant and prolonged over time, so it's not a parachuting in one-time intervention?
It's a $1 trillion question. Look, I think all of us can align that partnerships are probably the recipe for scale. I think the trick is really figuring out the recipe for successful partnerships. And what I'd say is it comes down to really understanding what assets each of the partner brings to bear and where the strengths of each partner lies. One of the words that hasn't come up yet is trust. And I find that some partners in a partnership have the trust of the communities and the women that they're working with, and others don't. So how do you be deliberate in who isn't engaging and who is determining the areas of focus and the interventions? So one is really being intentional about understanding what assets the partners bring to bear. And maybe I'll just give you an example to bring this to light, because otherwise it's 100,000-foot level. So you mentioned Strive Women, which is all about unlocking access to capital for women entrepreneurs. We know that women entrepreneurs don't have access to the same capital stack that male entrepreneurs do. And so what we've been doing is really thinking about what partnerships we can bring to bear. So we're MasterCard, we have a network of financial institutions around the world, and we know which financial institutions want to lend to women. We have our civil society partner who has the trust in the community and who knows what the women need and who talk to the women all the time. And then we have the financial service providers who have a product set. Do they need to be customized? Yes. But they have the product set. And then, of course, we have government, and we know that government can help enable the right policy and regulatory frameworks to unlock access to capital. So being really clear on the roles and the assets partners bring to bear and figuring out how a 1 + 1 = 5 model.
Yeah, thank you for that. And your point on trust is so well taken, because if you don't have that social trust and the local buy-in, pretty much anything you're trying to do either will fail or it won't have the kind of effectiveness that you aspire for. And it doesn't matter who you are, you know, you could be the foundation, you could be MasterCard or anyone else. And when it comes to trust, an organization like SEED is absolutely critical. And Irene, I'd love to bring you in on this question and ask you a little bit about how it is that you engage with local leaders in order to build that kind of trust and in order to be able to sustain the training, the outreach that you all are doing, especially in rural or remote areas, and as part of that, bringing women to the forefront of change making.
Thank you for that question. Trust is very, very important. And of course, the communities and the health workers, whoever you work with, they're not, you know, many times people think that they may be, let's say, dumb, but they are not. They know what the challenges are. They know what the issues are. So they would observe. They will observe and say, this is someone we can trust, or this is an organization we can trust, or this is somebody who has a hidden motive. So what we are doing is that we ensure that they're engaged. They tell us what the issues are. So for example, recently we had our strategy. What we did is we engaged the health workers and spoke to them. What are the issues? And we embedded what they wanted into our new strategy. We engaged the community leaders, the district health officials. We engaged the government officials. So you find that your strategy or whatever you're doing really is something that the community believes in. And once you start implementing, they would lead that. The other aspect, I could give an example. When we had an epidemic of Ebola, so you find that when health workers give information, there is a bit of mistrust. So it so happened that we had the epidemic, and you know, communities were living, they're like, no, these people are lying to us. There's no epidemic, this is witchcraft. So we had to engage the community leaders and tell them, this is what is happening. And at the end of the day, they were able to tell us, you know, in this particular village, people have been dying for a period of 1 month. So you see that they already knew, but because they were not engaged, then they couldn't come out. So it's very, very important to listen to them. The other aspect is using data and evidence. So, and of course, this is brought up by the health workers. They know that they're seeing a surge in this particular disease. So ensuring that they're involved, they can see the data, they can, you know, contribute surveillance, and they're also contributing to the solutions. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And you know, I'm a social scientist, so your call to action when it comes to data is music to my ears. But when we talk about call to actions, and you know, again, we want to not only seize the moment that UNGA and the Summit of the Future present, but sustain the momentum of it. And one of the things that each of you have talked about is the importance of taking an intersectional approach to break down silos. And so from each of your vantage points and the work that you're leading, for you on vision care and closing the gender gap, for you when it comes to financial inclusion and supporting resilient businesses, for you when it comes to community-led primary health care and health outreach, what is it that you hope that policymakers and decision makers will keep in mind for those respective areas when it comes to gender equality post-UNGA? And maybe Becky, I'll start with you and then we can go down the line.
Sure. Well, you know, I'm just thinking again about the cross-functionality of all these pieces and what the world would look like if we had 100% of the gender equity in all of these actions. You know, for me, it's incredibly important that we continue to raise women's roles in all of these issues and the importance of getting that involvement and really fulfilling that full circle. Without, it's incomplete. And really making sure for us in the vision care space that we, again, highlight the importance of vision care, continue to elevate those as SDGs, and make sure that we're in that process finding like-minded partners, whatever sector they may be in, because as we've all spoken, I think no matter what, I think any project we've spoken about touches on a little bit of each of what we're doing, and perhaps we have the expertise in our respective areas to do exactly that, to bring a lot of things to scale. So.
Over to you, Payal.
So I'll start, I think, where I started, which is around intersectionality. And I think Becky and Irene will agree with me that the first thing that I would really encourage everyone who is participating in UNGA and has influence in UNGA is to think about childcare, because I think it's a building block, childcare and elder care. I think it's a building block for economic opportunity and the ability to have the agency. So childcare is one. The second is we can't design for women without women. So it has to be in partnerships with the women we're trying to serve and the girls we're trying to serve. And the last thing I would just say is just to keep a gender lens on every single one of those 17 SDGs, because there is a gender component to everything.
Yeah, thank you. So for me, it would be, community-led and country-led. It's very critical for ownership and sustainability. The other aspect would be aligning with national priorities. Each of our countries has priorities, and the agenda is incorporated. So ensuring that we align and work together as partners, as opposed to duplication, opposed to working in silos and competition. But we need to work together and be in support of national priorities, not in leadership, not leading, but really being there to support the national priorities that are there, and of course listening, ensuring that we are listening to the communities, we are listening to the women, we are listening to the girls and the health workers, whatever program we are working on, ensuring that we listen to the communities that we serve.
I love that, and I think that applies to so much in life, not just the work that you all have been talking about that you're trying to advance, but just more broadly as well. Well, Becky, Payal, Irene, I can't thank you enough for taking the time for such a rich conversation and such your complementary perspectives. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Please welcome Nawe Moss, Women's Health and Research Advocate and Bridge Commission Co-Chair, Papa Sek, Chief of the Research and Data Section at UN Women, and Marie Teal, VP at UCB Biopharma and Bridge Commission Co-Chair, along with Foreign Policy's Alison Carlson, for a panel discussion on filling the data gaps in women's health research.
Hello, everyone. Great to see you, so many familiar faces, and thank you for joining us today, and thank you for joining us online as well. We're just absolutely thrilled to have such an incredible group here in the audience, but also here on stage, and so many of the conversations are really additive, building on each other. And what we're going to talk about now is about the importance of data and gender disaggregated data. And if you are a Her Power fan and frequent attendee and were at our DC Her Power a few months ago, we had the opportunity to talk about the importance of sex disaggregated data, why it matters, how can it inform policymaking, investments, resource allocation. So we're building on that conversation as well. And in today's conversation, really talking about why it's important as it relates to women and their health. And that's something that doesn't get talked about enough. And I think there's a real opportunity here to dive into the expertise and also the experience that all of you have on this subject matter and why we should all care and why it matters. And so, Papa, I'd like to turn to you first. So you are the chief of UN Women's data program and Women Count. And so you are in charge of this mobilization of effort within UN Women. So I'd like to start with you to just paint a bit of a picture of the data landscape. What does it look like right now, and how would you characterize the data landscape as it relates to women in health?
Thank you very much, and it's really a pleasure to join you to discuss this issue. I live and breathe it, so it's always a pleasure to talk about it. So on women's health, perhaps let me start with overall the data landscape, because I think they are linked, right? So when it comes to data, so we've just released this report. It's called the SDG Gender Snapshot last week. And what it tells us is that we have progress, but also regress. It's really, I think the report is really a tapestry of, where we are advancing, but also where we are regressing. So, and for health, it's particularly important, because if we don't advance on poverty, if we don't advance on nutrition, if we don't advance on education, we don't advance on health, because those are the social determinants of it. And one of the biggest challenges when it comes to, when it came to the health goal, so that's SDG 3, what we found is that we do see some progress on, for example, contraception, but it's painfully slow, just like all the SDGs. But when it comes to one of the most important indicators, which is maternal mortality, the latest data we have is from 2020, from before COVID, right? So decisions are being made, investments are being made with absolutely deficient data, right? Data that dates back years. So that's really, I think, one of the challenges that we need to solve. And when it comes to, when we looked at all data sets, what we found is the same. Countries have only produced about half of the data that they need to make decisions on SDGs, about half. So, that's again a challenge. And some of the biggest problems are, one, funding, and the other is capacity from countries. And just one final point is really on the data usage part. That's even worse than on data production. The little bit of data that we have, we don't use. And that, again, I think is a challenge that needs solved.
I would love to come back to a few points that you just made about production, dissemination, and use, and how we can fill some of those gaps that you mentioned. But first, before going there, Marie, I'd love to turn to you. And from your experience and with Bridge, as it relates to women and health, but also pregnant women, breastfeeding women, why does this matter?
Yes, thank you, Alison, and thank you for having me here. It's a very important topic, very dear to my heart. And so why does it matter? We heard from Papa, lack of data, and even when they are there, were not disseminated well. Well, for pregnant women, there's absolutely no generation of data. So do you know that women with chronic diseases and women in general, and 70% of the women will take at least one prescription medication during their pregnancy, at one point of their pregnancy. This is pretty stunning, and this is across the world. And so when you look at the data that we have actually less than 5% of these medications that have some information to inform decision making. And when you think of today, in a world where we are basing all our decisions on data, how is it that women have to make that choice without any information about a very important time of their life? And the reason is we've excluded women from clinical trials for a long, long time. As a matter of fact, most of our clinical trials require exclusion or contraception at inclusion. And so we need to think differently about it. We need to really shift this paradigm from a time where we are systematically excluding to a time where we're thinking about why we are excluding and why there are good reasons to include and to generate information for these women so they can make an informed decision. And this is why we set up Bridge. This is why this commission was put together to start with a multidisciplinary team of experts, understanding what we need to do with the patient in the commission and the patient starting the discussion. What do we need to do to generate this data, to bring informed decision? What do we need to do to shift this paradigm and make sure that women have the information they need at the time of their pregnancy?
Yeah, I think you bring up a number of really important points about inclusion and also translating back to how we can fill these gaps in data. Certainly there are a number of gaps from places that are considered data rich, but in data poor areas, countries, that exclusion is even greater. And so would love to talk through a little bit more about how you're all thinking about filling those gaps. And one way I would like to turn to you, Nawe, from your perspective and your experience. Why is it important to fill those gaps from a personal experience? And I think that can also then help inform how these strategies can be more inclusive.
Okay, so my name is Nawai, and I have epilepsy. I was diagnosed when I was 11 years old, and it was quite well controlled, and I never thought about, what impact that would have on having a child. But then when it gets to that point in your life where you want to have children, then all of a sudden you realize, the decision that you take at that point on whether you stay on your medication, whether you stop, whether you change medication, has really significant implications for you, your baby, if anything goes wrong, for example. And it's only during that time when, I was thinking about having a child that those issues kind of start to come to the fore. And in the process of trying to make those decisions, you go to your doctor and you ask your health professional, and the doctor doesn't know. And you don't know, and the reason is because there's no data or very little data and information. So you're taking a decision on how you manage your health with a chronic condition, based on nothing. And you have to live with the consequences of those decisions for the rest of your life. So if something goes wrong, with your baby, then actually you and your family have to manage that for the long term. So I think that was one of the difficult decisions for me. And as a result of, not being able to find what I felt that I needed, I took part in research. I was very lucky. I had the opportunity at my hospital to take part in research. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do it was because I didn't have the opportunity to make that decision. There was no data. So I would really want that for other women coming behind me, that they would have the opportunity. And so it was important for me to give something back, and that my experience, there would be learning from that. I felt that was really important. So I think that gives a little bit of context as to why, why on a very personal level, this is really important.
Thank you for that, and really appreciate you sharing your experience and your perspective, because, as we were talking about backstage, I think often we have these conversations that are about policy and investment and what's needed that we principally agree with, but yet aren't really understanding how it resonates very personally and deeply in lives. And so thank you for sharing that with us and with our audience, because it resonates that much more. And so I wonder, and I'd like to turn to both you, Papa and Marie, when you're thinking about this and thinking about innovation in data acquisition and data production and inclusive strategies for doing that. I remember one of the comments, Papa, that you made in our previous discussion about gender disaggregated data was means of collection and actually going to the people and them being a source of that data and ability to fill some of those gaps. So as it relates to women in health broadly and women who are pregnant, breastfeeding, how can they be more inclusive, and are are you working with programs, or you see anything that's particularly innovative or transformative in this space that is kind of pushing the dial to make sure that it is more inclusive? Whoever would like to go first.
Sure. So basically at UN Women, I lead a global program called Women Count. It's a $70 million program on data. And one thing that I think, again, we've learned over the last, I would say, 8 years is really the issue of inclusion. Because the data collection cannot just be extractive, right? You can't just go to communities, collect the data, you know, pack your bags and go, right? It doesn't work. So in order for the data to be useful for policy, but also for people, it really needs to be inclusive. So that's the reason why, you know, for example, over the last few years, we've started working on citizen-generated data. And citizen-generated data connected to citizen science really, you know, make sure that, you know, the data that you are collecting is from citizens, and it goes back to them. And what we've seen is that, you know, that level of engagement can really lead to better, you know, awareness, but also service delivery from civil society organizations who are really those working at the community level. But that also needs to be complemented by other data sets. But we live in an age of information these days, right? So we do have the traditional data sets that are collected by national statistical offices. That's official data. It's really important. But also, you know, we can collect data from administrative sources, from big data and so forth. So it's really, you know, again, collating different data sets that can tell us more. But as long as we don't have inclusion of all stakeholders, we don't advance.
Marie?
So for us and for Bridge, we know we need to all be part of it. We need to all collectively work on that. It's not for patients and patient organizations to alone do it. It's not for policymakers. It's not we all for pharma or for researchers by themselves. The only way we can succeed there is to do it together. And so we're thrilled to see the initiative and the funding that is now given to women's research. And we are hoping that this funding is going to go, in some particular examples, to pregnancy and breastfeeding, because it's really important to go in that direction. This is the future of our societies, and we really need to think about it. But collectively, we can do it together. We just need to make sure that we educate all of us, the researchers, the pharmaceutical companies, the policymakers, importantly, the patients and the women, so that they trust the data that we are giving, and they trust giving their data, and we are able to give them back what they need to hear. That we need to be able to give them and communicate the outcome of this research, because only then we will be able to generate more.
A few really important points to pick up on, and something that you said at the outset, Papa, about the efforts to identify the social determinants of health and how important those are as part of this context as well, and the environments that women, pregnant women, and others are living in that are contributing to health outcomes, and how in data scarce environments, data will never be perfect. The data sets will never be complete. How can we utilize the data that we have, and when appropriate and applicable, utilize technology to project or at least inform others about what we do know and make those connections between what science and data science is finding about the social determinants of health, for example. We were part of a previous conversation today about the role of AI in that, and really trying to understand how those tools can help project and more deeply understand population health with smaller data sets. But I wonder if you can, each of you, provide a concrete example of how you're seeing those bridges being made between citizen-centric data, between your own experience, and how that is informing what is being done at the hospital, how the research that you contributed to is having an impact, and how the partnerships that you're describing, kind of the mechanics, the maybe not so sexy aspects of these things, but I think those are the elements that we don't talk about as much. How is this working? And who are you working with that is showing promise?
Shall I start?
Yes, please.
So I think it's really important that we involve women in the design of research all the way through the life cycle of the research, because then that means that we're going to be capturing the data and the outcomes that we want as women to know. And so I think that's one component, making sure that there's involvement. And also because as women, we are living with the conditions, yeah, and we really have a vested interest in this. You know, the health professionals go home at the end of the day, but we still have our conditions that we've got to manage. So I think that's one important component, and also to help share the findings. So we said even when we do have data, we need to be able to leverage and maximize the use that it can have. And I think by involving patients, but women within the research is a really important way to do that. I also think that women really want to take part in research. They need to have the opportunity to do that. And I think actually everyone has a different threshold of what they're willing to do as part of the research element. Yeah, so some women might just be happy to share their data as part of a bigger research program, for example, while others might want to take part in a trial, for example. So we just need to enable women to have the opportunity to take part in research and offer them, that opportunity to have an impact.
Marie, I'll turn to you actually to build off of what Noah said, and also as bridge, how some of those bridges are being formed, and really getting to this question of use. While limited and there are data gaps, how can we ensure that it's used?
Yeah, so this is how we set up the Bridge Commission, really to think about how we're going to generate the data, but how they're going to be used and communicated. And I think this is really why, so practically, to a very practical question, we have researchers in Bridge, we have patients, and patients talk about what they want, what they need, the type of data that they want to have, and in what format. And I think only if we had two patients and we listen and we make sure that they're getting the information they need, we will be able to stimulate research there and to stimulate knowledge and understanding of what it means to make an informed decision when you have a chronic disease and you want a pregnancy. So we're working with policymakers, we're working with regulators, we're going to a mindset of, as I said, shifting the paradigm from protecting women through research, not from research, as this is key, and this is what policymakers, regulators, patients, researchers, ethicists are all now working on, and we see that movement. It's coming. So I would encourage all of you to look at the Bridge report and see very practical recommendation on how each of us can contribute. All of us can contribute to this and make it better for women and their future babies.
And Papa, when you think about data dissemination and sharing of data, which especially in this space can be complicated and complex, what are you focused on and what are you hopeful about regarding progress in dissemination and ultimately the use of this data?
So one of the things that we do, for example, as part of this program that I mentioned, is at the national level, we bring stakeholders together, different ones. So line ministries, National Statistical Office, civil society, researchers, so particularly academia, so donors, donor countries, for example. So when you bring them together, I think you do start to find solutions. And here, the data collection, and this is really important, the data collection doesn't start, if you want good data, it doesn't start at the collection stage. It starts at, why do we need this data stage? And that is, again, stakeholders who will use that data. They are the ones who are making that decision. And once you bring them around the table, you start to find solutions. Maybe we can't collect this data through a survey, but we can find it through administrative sources, or we can find it online, etc. So that, again, it's that part about inclusion that really helps with both the data collection, but also ultimately the dissemination, because those are the same stakeholders who will use the data.
The partnerships that you all reference are incredibly important, and what's exciting too is there are so many people in this room and outside the doors and online who are interested in working on or in other ways possible partners. And so it sounds like, if you don't mind, an invitation for greater engagement with everyone here and everyone outside about how you can be more inclusive, what roles do you have that are complementary, and to get engaged so that these partnerships form an ecosystem of sorts, because I think it's also important that the efforts underway are aligned, streamlined, scaled, which is easy to say, of course. But to your point that you just made, Papa, I think the first question I asked to all of you was, why should we care and why does this matter? And I think you all articulated it incredibly well. And so if you had, along the backdrop of the UN General Assembly and all of the people in this room, kind of a call to action or an ask, what is the one thing that you hope people take away from this conversation and why it's important to you? Papa, I'm going to start with you, and then Marie, and then I'm going to end with you.
So what I've been telling everybody this week is take a data point, whatever it is, quote it to somebody else. Right? So if you're talking to someone, quote them something that you think is important. Because again, I think in these settings, what we can do is really share information with each other. Because that data point that you quote to somebody, you don't know what decision they can make that can actually change millions of lives. Right? So to me, I think it's that. It's really building on connections to advance together.
Well put. Marie?
So for me, it would be ask about this data. If you are a patient, ask your doctor. If you are a doctor, ask the pharmaceutical company that is making the drug. The pharmaceutical company should talk to regulators and policymakers. The more we ask about it, the more we will be able to generate them. And this is how all of us eventually will have access to this data.
Wonderful. And now, how about from you?
Thank you. So I think from my perspective, I just want you to consider that women are getting pregnant today, they're breastfeeding today and tomorrow. And one of the things is that with research and data generation, it can take a really long time from the design of the research to doing the research, and then for any findings to feed back into the system. So we need to be thinking about this and acting on this today. So I really urge you to, try your best within your spheres. Like Marie said, ask questions. We've put together the Bridge report, so there's some copies outside or downloaded online, because we've really tried to think about practical recommendations, things that you can just pull up, and it's split by stakeholder group. So hopefully it will give you some inspiration. But I really appreciate you being here today, and I feel so passionately about this. And yeah, I really hope that it will be better for our daughters in the future.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for the work that you're doing. Appreciate it. And encourage all of you to engage together in a little while yet, after we're done with this session. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Her Excellency, Mrs. Toyin Saraki, founder and president of the Wellbeing Foundation Africa, and our moderator, Maggie Lake, for discussion on women's leadership, health equity, and global impact.
Well, hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you in person and for everyone joining online. And there is so much good energy and familiar faces in the audience. Your Excellency, thank you so much for being with us today. This is an unbelievable turnout.
Thank you so much, Maggie. I'm delighted to be here. And let me first say thank you to Foreign Policy for making this conversation possible.
And we just finished hearing about the importance of data and the difference that that can make when it comes to women's health. But you come at this from a very personal experience that guides your mission and the work you've done in this area. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
You know, it's actually amazing that the last conversation ended up with data, because when I had my experience, after I reflected on what happened to me, basically 1991, I went into early labor. I was having twins, and it was actually also my wedding day, but I developed complications, and I lost one, and with the one that survived, I really had to do a worldwide search for the tools and equipment. So what we had in Nigeria is we had the people who knew what to do. What we didn't really have were the latest tools and innovation. And after that, the survival of both myself and one of my twins, I committed to myself that if it could have happened to me, it could have happened to anyone, because certainly I wasn't in the bracket that anybody would call underprivileged, and came as a bit of a shock. So I've really devoted most of the rest of my life to finding those tools, bringing them back, putting them to scale, making sure they fit our context, developing our own homegrown practices. But the first thing I did when looking for a solution actually was embrace data. So I sat down and I studied what I considered to be the best maternal and child health record in the world. And then I called experts together and I wrote a version for Nigeria, because I felt that we couldn't just continue burying our mothers without explanation. And if you don't seek the truth and the explanation, you can't find the right solution. So for me, it's data to save the people. But in that data, the deep dive is to explain what the challenge is to know what is the right solution.
That's right. Without that framework, it is just data, right? You have to then take it and use it into action. And that passion that drives your purpose coming out of that tragedy, I feel like we hear so much of that passion, even in the last, throughout the session so far, that's driving this progress. And it's reflected in the turnout tonight, which is amazing. So when we look at this, what do you think is, where are we? Give us a gut check on where we are in the progress. We've come a long way from your experience, but where are we based on the work you're doing at Wellbeing?
Well, based on the work I'm doing at Wellbeing, I'll say we've made a lot of progress. But the fact that I'm still looking for solutions to tackle the same problem 30 years later shows that actually the world has also stagnated. First of all, what I would say is that we know the right investments. So we know what is killing women in childbirth. And even though we're dealing with that problem because that was the challenge underneath our noses, we also now know actually that women's health lags behind men's health because we tend to approach women's health at 2 or 3 key points in a woman's, I will call it the health cycle. So we approach women's health when she's going to have a baby, and then we approach women's health again if she needs a screening for a sort of a cancer. And then we only approach women's health again. We're only compelled to approach women's health again when disaster strikes and she's at death's door. And this is really, really wrong. You know, no investment in any field, let alone in the human development field, works if you only approach it 3 times. So I have been pushing for a bigger whole life cycle, health cycle of the woman approach, right from birth up till age. We know, for instance, that women actually have a high proportion of cardiovascular disease, especially older women, the age that I am now. But nobody's, if you look at the adverts, they always say advertisements reflect life's questions. You look on TV and you'll never see a cardiovascular heart disease advert targeted at women. At the very most, you'll see the advert targeted at men, and the female partner is there rubbing his back and rushing him to the hospital. But actually, women are. So I'm looking at it now from a rights-based approach, and we are seeing problems that we have found a solution to in our world, in the global South, resurge in the global north. I mean, the Black and minority ethnicity death rate in childbirth here, to me, is directly linked to the ratio of professional midwives to mothers. But to me, it's very obvious because I have been dealing with that every day. But when you're in a country that has high technology and highly medicalized, sometimes they will overlook that a pregnant woman needs a professional, trained midwife who is focusing on pregnant women's health, who understands how to assure her dignity, to advise her through the pregnancy. And it's not a big investment. You know, any doctor will tell you there are only 4 medicines that you can give a pregnant woman safely. So really, if you want to keep a pregnant woman alive and thriving, the rest of your investment must be in putting the woman power, the manpower, whether physically or digitally, at her disposal to respond to her questions and guide her through her pregnancy. And this same approach, the human resource correct deployment approach, really is something that we need to take through the entire health cycle of women's health. I really advocate strongly for midwives and nurses as the ideal guardians, influencers, and promoters for women's health, because this is what they do. This is what they studied. This is what they trained for. And this is what they love to do. We should remunerate them, and we should deploy them, and we should make sure we have a pipeline that's creating enough of them to service us and our needs.
It's a fantastic point. Yes, that deserves a round of applause. When I was first found out I was pregnant, my gynecologist had a midwife on staff.
Yeah.
It's not the norm, and it made all the difference. So you're absolutely right. What are the aside from that, that's one solution. What are you seeing? Let's lean into the progress and the opportunity, and then we'll talk a little bit about the barrier.
Okay, well, what I'm seeing, first of all, in
What's working?
Okay, what is working? Yeah. What is working is a certain respect and dignity in the co-creation of programming. So long gone are the days where I would hear about some program in the global north and be sitting down and trying to write my 120 pages of grant. Now, when I want to do a program, I sit down with my donor, and my donor also sees me as a donor because I'm donating. What I'm bringing to the table is territory, competence, accountability, transparency, and it's a co-investment model. So you might want, for instance, to wipe out jaundice. Now, I'm not the sort of implementer that's just going to say, okay, here's 6 hospitals in here, just give them the light boxes. I'm going to do a deep dive. I'm going to co-create that program with you. So for instance, I've just finished co-creating a program which is going to roll as a whole state program. And I'm insisting it's a whole state program because, you know, I come from that community. I can't run a program if there's 20 hospitals in this state. I'm not going to select 10 and leave out the other 10 because I can't look my people in the eye for who I'm not going to give it to. So it's community-centered, community-driven, and you're right. When you come from that community and you're sitting with the global and you're co-designing a program, you write with sustainability in mind because you know that that funding is not going to last forever. So you're building local ownership into the program. You're transferring the knowledge, transferring the skills, and taking knowledge as well, because by the way, the world is a global village. I think the estimate is that by 2030, 1 in every 2 persons in America will be of African descent, and then 1 in every 2 of those will be a Nigerian. So really,
she got the memo on the big number, share a data point with someone.
Which is where I come from. So actually, as I'm strengthening my health system at home and helping to train our health workers at home, I'm trying to transfer that knowledge to you as well, because, you know, we are going to start appearing on the doorsteps, and we need the same knowledge everywhere. You know, if you look at the issue of preeclampsia, which I suffered from, there's a lot of data to show now that some of us are predisposed to that because we are exposed to cooking fumes indoors, you know, from fossil fuels. Yeah. And it's strange. You see it here in the African American community, you see it in the West African community, and then you see it in Australia. And, you know, so when you're really looking at the DNA, we are not linked to the Australians. There may be, if you look at our ancestry, you will find some correlation between myself and an African American, but I don't think you will find a correlation between myself and an Australian. So that means it has to be something about behavioral practice. So what works is respecting your partners. What works is transparency, accountability. What works is long-term funding. What works is having enough room in a program. For instance, in our AMONC program, we made it whole state, and we trained, I think, 68 master trainers in clusters. We also left 13 labs, 2 centers of excellence. Those 68 master trainers trained a further 6,900 health workers who served a further 62,800 mothers to deliver safely without birth injury every year. And it was amazing. I went to the front line to take a look at how the program was doing. And I met an obstetrician of 11 years post-qualification. And when I said to him, so how'd you like the training program? He started to cry. You know, tears were actually coming out of his eyes. He kept his composure, but tears were coming out of his eyes. And I said, why are you crying? And he said, you know, I'm 11 years post-qual. And I have been doing episiotomies on women every day. And it's just now that I've learned that when I'm going in to do the episiotomy, I can put my fingertip over the scalpel before I make the cut. And I cut from the inside first to come to the outside, and I can do just 3 stitches to close the episiotomy afterwards for the woman to be able to heal. So I said, so how were you doing it before? And he made a sawing movement. And yeah, we're all women, so now that is the sort of program that improves the availability and quality of maternal and newborn care. And I'm delighted, you know, that was a 5-year program. It was supported by Johnson & Johnson, and I have a very solid technical partner, Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, for that program. But we use simulation models to also teach the correct techniques, you know, how to revive a baby who arrives not breathing. And it led to, I think, in the first 6 months, there was a 22% drop in mortality. But the state in which we ran that program has consistently, ever since, come top in survival rates in Nigeria. And even when they see a blip, because maybe policy-wise or politically-wise, somebody's tried to do something different, they come back very quickly within the next 2 months and say, you know, can we do some refresher? And I say, well, we've left you a center of excellence. You go do your refresher.
I love this conversation because it's talking about what's possible, what's working, when you have the right ingredients in place, the right partnerships in place, and the right passion behind it. We are incredibly out of time. I feel like we are all bemoaning that because we definitely need more with you. But if we could just leave everyone with a thought about, and it's the same one that Allison asked, if you had the ear of everyone, what would you like to see done? What can you leave us all with?
If I had the ear of everyone, I would say please invest in women-led programming. You know, we cannot be talking women-led programming. Put that gender lens across every single investment. Put the human rights lens across every single investment, and then put the transparency and accountability lens across every single investment. That makes for better partnerships. It makes us even learn from our failures, and it leads to better program design. And then the last thing I would say is always seek for scale. You know, I've been a little bit jealous, and I'll leave you with this. I've been listening to other organizations, some of which I'm also part of, and they will be talking about Sierra Leone and Liberia, and we're all clapping, including myself. And then when I finish clapping, I remind myself that Liberia is the size of one state in Nigeria. So if you're looking for scale, I would ask you to, you know, hold your courage, come to Nigeria. There are enough partners there. And, you know, if you've really got something that you claim is successful, bring it to me. Let me try it out. I'll tell you if it's successful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Please welcome Lori Edelman, Executive Director of Planned Parenthood Global, Dr. Samu Dube, Executive Director of Family Planning 2030, Kathleen Mogulgard, President and CEO of the Population Institute, and Foreign Policy's Allison Carlson, for a discussion on evolving priorities and expanding rights.
Thank you. Wow, that was powerful. Chills and inspired, and the call to action is quite clear. So really appreciate that. And I think this conversation will build on her remarks quite well. You know, what we're focusing on this conversation is really looking at sexual and reproductive health and rights around the world, and doing a little bit of a stock take. Where are we right now? What's happening here in this country and around the world? And you know, this is the ICPD 30th anniversary, and I think it provides an opportunity for us to think about that for a second, and for us to reflect on what progress has been made in the last 30 years since the conference, you know, of population and development. And so Kathleen, I'd like to first turn to you. When you think about that and the work you're doing with the Population Institute, how would you take stock? What progress has been made, and where do we need to go?
Thank you, Allison. I am really delighted to be having this conversation at this moment when we are reflecting on 30 years since the International Conference on Population and Development and everything that it means, and what we can learn from that and where we can go moving forward. And I'm just delighted to be having this conversation with my colleagues on this panel as well, because I think we all recognize, and we still continue to really internalize, that incredible consensus that was achieved in Cairo on reproductive autonomy, the idea that every person has the right to freely and responsibly determine the number, timing, and spacing of childbearing, and that we all deserve access to the information and the services that can help us make those choices. That was a really unprecedented consensus back in 1994. It is something that we have continued to internalize and fight for. And I think this moment of the 30th anniversary of ICPD also is a moment for us to reflect on the ways in which reproductive autonomy connects to so many components of a sustainable future, and a future that we can be moving toward that leaves no one behind. I've heard a lot of talk today about intersectionality, and that is something that is really part of the ICPD program of action, talking about how those individual rights connect to so many of the other different kinds of sustainable development goals that we're trying to achieve. The program of action had important things to say about economic growth, poverty alleviation, the rights of migrants, the environment. And this is really a great moment for us to reflect on both the critical importance of reproductive autonomy and the rights that come along with that to the individual, as well as how those rights scale up to the population level in ways that has really important implications for a sustainable future that leaves no one behind.
I think you frame that really well and really underscore and articulate it's transcendent, and sexual reproductive health and rights affect everything. And it's not just women, it affects everyone, and it affects populations, and it affects all of the sustainable development goals. And so when we think about SRHR, and Samu, I'd like to turn to you, if you could break that down and share what ways are you seeing that manifest in the lack of access to sexual and reproductive health and the lack of rights around the world. How does that show up, and what are you seeing happening in women's lives and communities around the world where you work?
Thank you for that question, and good day, everybody. I think first we should acknowledge the progress that we have made. We have said since Cairo, since FP 2030 was formed, that was like in 2012, since many of us existed. it took us a long time, to say in 1994, now we're going to make change, right? But we've made progress. To date, we've got about 377 million people who are using contraception, which is great. We've got, since 2012, when FP 2030 was formed, we have had an additional 92 million new users of family planning, modern contraception, and that's what I'm talking about, and that is great. We have had about 60 countries that have made some strides in legislative reforms that actually encourage even a comprehensive SRHR framework, and that is good news. But we are seeing many more women and young people across the world who are demanding to use modern contraception, and they're not having access. And this is a challenge. In fact, the unmet need remains at above 260 million people globally. And we're also seeing some pushback. We're seeing organized resistance, organized opposition across the globe, not just threatening the comprehensive SRHR access, but threatening, actually it's like sexism. The sum of sexism has been greater than even the pursuit for GDPs globally. We're seeing a world uniting, against why are women being empowered? Why are we having SRHR? Even more than how they are uniting for fortunes of GDPs, and that is scary. What are we doing, and why does this matter? This matters because where there is no access to SRHR, you are denying women, young people, that ability to decide a different trajectory of their lives. I recently came from rural Zimbabwe, where I think I've said this before to some audiences. I saw a 15-year-old who was pregnant. I saw a 17-year-old who was pregnant. And people were not enraged about that, because that is rape. They were deliberating on, when is this person going to get married? Right? That is the conversation. And I think that shows that whilst we have made progress, we have taken some steps back. We are seeing a decline in funding on SRHR in some spaces and some countries. We are seeing that even though the demand is growing, it's not commensurate with the needs that are there on the ground. When you deny women SRHR access, you are denying them an education, an ability, and an opportunity to complete their education, to enter the workforce, to actually participate in society as equals. And you are denying an investment in human capital. And that is a challenge. And you know what? 2030 is around the corner. 1,925 days left, and we are not going to achieve sustainable development goals if we do not invest in sexual reproductive health in its entirety.
Yes, very, very well put. And you're right, we do need to acknowledge the progress that has been made. Both of your comments, I think, shine a light on that really well. And also be very clear-eyed about the world we presently live in and the backsliding that's happening. And so how do we stop that? Even the UN Secretary General has acknowledged the backsliding that is happening with sexual and reproductive health and rights around the world, and the treatment of women. And so, Lori, I'd like to turn to you. When you think about your work with Planned Parenthood Global, how are these issues manifesting? How are you seeing that backsliding? And what are some of the ways that you and your colleagues are working to reverse that trend?
Thank you so much for that question, and so grateful to be here with my colleagues today on these important issues. And at Planned Parenthood Global, we are the international arm of Planned Parenthood Federation of America. And the reason I mention that and the reason it's important is because we're here talking about a global agenda, and we're sitting in New York during UNGA. And one piece of this puzzle is that the US is a part of the globe. The US is not separate or outside of that. And we need new models and modes of transnational solidarity and connection points in order to connect the dots between everything that is going on here in the US and in so many countries worldwide, where in some cases, yes, we're seeing all of the backsliding that you mentioned, and in some cases, feminist movements have got it figured out, or they've made a win, or they've seen progress. We saw an advancement in a small country called Benin, where I don't think eyes were on Benin to see an advancement in the abortion policy there, and they did that. We, of course, have the green wave washing across Latin America. And where are the lessons that we're learning from that, and how are we making sure that we're fostering the innovations that are working in this very difficult moment and investing in those and scaling those up? And so our model is really to support and invest financially and otherwise in amazing grassroots groups so that we have a locally led and globally connected movement that can really push forward the agenda that has been described as ICPD. And we need to recognize that the implementation is not there. We've not yet realized ICPD, and yet we also need to hold that truth that we can push ICPD further. We can queer ICPD. We can youth, this is going to sound bad, YOUTH, euthanize ICPD, okay? We need to recognize that in addition to the horrendous number that you described around unmet need, in some of the countries where Planned Parenthood Global is working, we see unmet need among adolescents who say that they don't want to be pregnant at 60 or 70% of the population for adolescents. We are not setting young people up for success when that is the reality. And that is not okay, and that needs to be a huge part of the agenda that we're all pushing.
Thank you for that. And you're absolutely right that we need to push that envelope and what solutions are working and what is also having impact at scale, and the programs that aren't being siloed for one community or another, but recognizing that humans, adolescents, are complex and have complex health and reproductive needs, and meeting them where they're at. And this conversation is following one that we had a little bit ago about the evidence and how to integrate the evidence into the policies, into the investments, into the resource allocation. And so in the spirit of thinking through how can we utilize the evidence to inform the programs that are having impact, Kathleen, I'd like to turn to you. What are you seeing as some of those promising programs that are utilizing the data, understanding what's happening in the communities on the ground so that the programs could be contextually relevant, better informed, and have the impact that will help address the backsliding?
Thank you for that question. And as a data nerd, I love having questions about utilizing evidence to shape policy and programmatic responses that really drive impact. Now, I have to say that the Population Institute is not a program implementer, so we don't have that front line on the program approaches that are having the biggest bang for the buck in terms of advancing SRHR. But what we do understand is we kind of look at data sources across sectors. And I've really been encouraged today by the kinds of conversations that have been happening about multi-sectoralism, intersectionality, and really understanding how health indicators connect with indicators in other sectors that are related. But more often than not, we are not having those kind of integrated conversations. So for example, we work with partners in Niger and Uganda that are really interested in better understanding how SRHR and climate change impacts overlap with one another, and how can we shape climate change responses, those responses that are meant to build people's resilience and adaptive capacity. And when we're talking about reproductive autonomy, as a mother, I can hardly think of anything that would be more important for my own resilience as being able to determine the number, timing, and spacing of my own children. And so it's exciting to be working with partners who are doing these kind of integrated approaches that bring in components of SRHR into climate change adaptation and resilience programs, because people don't live their lives in silos. We live very complicated lives, and thinking about how we can bring these kinds of interventions together, there is data and evidence that shows that there are synergies there, that we get better outcomes for natural resource management or for climate change resilience. And we get better outcomes for some of the reproductive health indicators when these things are integrated with one another. And yet we don't often see that integration happening on the ground. We don't see the financing that would support that kind of broad multi-sectoral approach. So that is that is an opportunity as we move forward beyond ICPD plus 30 and thinking about the kinds of approaches that we need to be looking toward if we really truly want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the goals that will follow those.
A few key words I picked up on in all of the incredibly important points are integration, financing, and support, and really being able to scale that. And you've all mentioned commitments, and increasingly there are governments around the world that are making policy commitments to increasing SRHR. At the end of the day, as they say, your budget and your resource allocation really illustrates your principles and what you're willing to commit your scarce resources to. And I really appreciate how you reference the opportunity and how we're thinking about this as an opportunity. And I think that reframing really needs to be focused on. And when we're thinking about resource allocation, not as a cost, but as an investment, and the return on investment that will be had by countries, regions, communities if those investments are made. And so I'd like to talk about that a little bit more and talk about it in nuts and bolts. So we often talk about we need more financing, resource allocation at a high level, and yes, that is always true. But I'm wondering how and what mechanisms are actually working that are translating into having impact in women's and communities' lives for all of you. And so, Samu, I'd like to turn to you, and with Made Possible, how are you thinking about investments and that ROI?
That's a great one. ROI, I like that phrase, right? Because from where I sit, we know and we do have evidence that for every dollar that is spent on family planning, you are actually going to get like $8 back, and family planning pays back, it pays off, it pays dividends, it pays forward, it's future proof, and family planning makes many things possible. So with those phrases, we are launching this campaign where we are saying made possible by family planning, because for many of us, we are here today because our lives have been made possible through family planning. We all have a family planning moment, a family planning story, and we want to normalize that language even on how we invest and investing differently. We know where we're sitting right now, we've got about 15% less investments than we had in 2019, and that is scary. So in this campaign, we would love to have more money and new money, right? And we would love to have new partners. Obviously, many of you are invited to join this campaign, and new momentum so that we can achieve the results. We need to normalize family planning. By the time we get to 2030, we shouldn't be trading it off for political votes, for other conversations, or for whatever reason. We should be normalizing it. And that's why making different investments, we are calling on Global Fund. We are leaving opportunity at the table, for example, when we're talking about HIV programs. The siloed approach in terms of how investments are done, we are leaving opportunity at the table, and we are saying no more. We do not want to go back there. We want to go forward as we are going to 2030. That's why Made Possible by family planning is now a thing.
Yes, it is now a thing. And thank you. Thank you for articulating that and laying that out, all the reasons for which Made Possible and investing in women, communities, and SRHR will bear dividends, direct, cascading. And we do need to remember that when we're thinking about, again, what are scarce resources. Lori, I'd like to turn to you. I know in a previous conversation, we were talking about some of the financial supports, flexible instruments, ways in which you're able to support those on the ground who need it and need it urgently. And so if you could talk a little bit more about that and your experience and what some of those supports have looked like and the way they've impacted lives and why that flexibility is really important.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. And when it comes to funding this work and creating an overall enabling environment, the circumstances under which delivery of care can happen, delivery of sexual and reproductive health and rights, the full spectrum can happen, who leads matters. So it's not a best practice. We're not going to get our freedom and our rights if only those people who are, sitting in New York or DC or in a very beautiful, fancy UNGA conference room are just the ones saying, it's my decision, and we might care so much about this issue and know so much about this issue, but that doesn't mean that we're the ones that are meant to be leading the way. We can definitely utilize our sphere of influence. We can move that money. But we need to be making flexible feminist support possible. That means unrestricted grants at times. That means saying, hey, here's an organizational development grant if you can, or hey, I can't put funds forward right now, but I can connect you to someone who can, to the right donor. And it's really important the how that we practice our movement work and our enabling environment work. And I want to go back to the point that you made around how we document and build evidence. And this is an example of how the who leads matters. So we have seen that attacks against LGBTQ rights and peoples are also attacks on sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we have seen that attacks on many different groups end up being attacks on others. And so I think as Planned Parenthood, we are supporting groups who are documenting and collecting stories of human rights violations that are happening under the Anti-Homosexuality Act in Uganda. And the reason that that's really important is not only because it's incredibly immoral what's happening, but because if we allow the HIV community to be over there and the reproductive health community to be over there, that is an interruption in service delivery. And the reason we ended up doing that is because, yes, it's our values, but also because of the stories that we were hearing from our longtime partners on the ground who were saying, under the Anti-Homosexuality Act, we're unable to deliver our family planning or our HIV prevention work in our program. And so we need to always be listening. We need to be funding in ways that allow grantees and partners to raise up the issues that they are having and to give us that feedback and tell us as funders. And we need to be brave, all of us in our sphere of influence, whatever that means and looks like, whether you're a funder, an intermediary, or a grantee partner, or none of the above just yet, and stand up and say, hey, it might be a little bit uncomfortable to talk about sex or sexuality or reproductive health and rights right now. Maybe it's a little more comfortable for me to stay in my lane over here. But actually that discomfort can get really magnified, and we need to leverage our position of privilege and influence wherever that's possible, because it can really save lives.
Very well put. I think we all have a role, responsibility to play in that, as you said, in all of our lives, wherever we may be. Here in New York, outside, but also we have the privilege of being here and need to make sure that the work that we're doing is having a direct effect elsewhere. And so we're out of time, but I would love to hear from each of you quickly, in light of the fact that we are here, what would be, in your mind, in the work that you do, a big win that's needed here and would actually have impact on the ground? Who wants to start?
I can start. I think I've been thinking a lot as we've been reflecting on the 30th anniversary of ICPD, the really critical financing commitments that 179 nations agreed to, a costed agenda for delivering reproductive health and family planning. I'm not sure we're going to close that gap. By some estimates, we have about a $5 billion gap globally for meeting those needs, and the population has only grown bigger in the 30 years since ICPD. But if we could make some progress this week, in the months to come, in getting governments to recognize that they made those commitments and to charting a pathway toward closing that gap for meeting the cost of meeting reproductive health and family planning needs globally, I think that would be amazing progress.
Well said. Lori?
Go in order. Well, there is a lot at stake in November, and I think that we know that the U.S. is a funder of these issues worldwide, and we want that to continue and to grow. And we don't want, unfortunately, the kinds of abortion bans that we are seeing in the U.S. That a report last week came out and showed that there are preventable deaths happening, which we already knew, but we know for a fact there are preventable deaths happening in this country and all over the world around abortion bans. So a big win for me would be no more abortion bans, and that the stakes of November are very clear to all, not only the impact in the US, but the impact to so many communities globally as well.
Mine is intentional leadership. Intentional leadership in all fronts. Many of us here belong to organizations where we need to make decisions, certain behaviors to advance the narrative. Let's go back home and do that. But more importantly, leadership at a country level. I have seen where governments seem not to care much about what happens to women. We need intentional leadership. If I were to wave a magic wand, we want those people who are going to take a step forward and do it for women and girls, because that really counts. And for me, where your mouth is, that's where you put your money. So that is shown in budgets as well.
Thank you. And I think that is a call to action for us all to go home and do something. So thank you for that, and thank you all for the work that you're doing.
Please welcome Dr. Natalia Kanem, Executive Director of the United Nations Population Fund, for a conversation on the global fight for reproductive rights.
Yes, thank you. Wonderful to see you. Thank you for joining us again this year. Absolutely thrilled and honored to be able to close us out today with a conversation with you and to follow up the discussion that was just had, and to hear from you and the work that you're doing, and to harness your insights about what more can and needs to be done as it relates to SRHR. You know, this UNGA, as you well know, is really focused on leaving no one behind. So from your perspective, and in light of the work that you're doing, where are we? How are we doing?
Well, where to start? Allison, it's great to be back with you. I really want to congratulate foreign policy, because I heard there were lines around the block, and I've been in the waiting room listening to the energy that's emanating from this group and understanding that people are online as well. This is a moment for us to think about power. I love the fact that you've named this Her Power, and that we're looking at action. We're not just going to sit here and lament and cry. We're going to figure out how are we going to sharpen our strategy, right? So let me confess that in the year when I'm going to turn 70, I'm looking back to the fact that as a student, I was in Mexico City in 1975. So next year, when we celebrate Beijing 30, right? The first women's conference was actually in Mexico City in 75. And of course, we've heard about ICPD. I personally was in Cairo in that year, where my predecessor from UNFPA, Nafis Sadiq, said, you know what, put women and girls at the center of development, and all the dots are going to connect. And we see that with the Sustainable Development Goals. So I want to proudly join you in claiming victory. Are things better for women and girls than they were 50? Yes, they are. And even in 30 years, we've seen that we've been able to cut deaths during childbirth. Parens, it's lamentable that 800 women still die every day around the world from stuff that's preventable, right? But it's still a lot less than it would have been. Can I talk about menstruation with guys in the room today? I hope you are. I certainly am. So we need to look at the trajectory of how progress evolves. And sadly, it is not in a straight line. So yeah, there's pushback. And should I say more about that?
Well, there is pushback. And as we were discussing a little bit in the previous conversation, a backsliding. So yes, progress has been made, But to your point, we need a strategy, and that needs to be informed. And so I appreciate your optimistic tone. And so when you think about that and you think about galvanizing all of us in the room, out there, online, and everyone here in New York, where do we need to focus and prioritize? And the State of the World report is coming out. What is the evidence that is able to be leveraged to inform that strategy to correct course?
Well, again, I think this is a great question that leads to insights. What makes a difference at scale? And you know what? We're talking about a girl in a village who, as much of a doctor as I am, I'm a bigger proponent of education, because we know that if she gets through secondary school, she's better off, her kids are better off, and actually to the next generation. So I will say that for UNFPA and for many of the partners that you've had, because the reproductive health movement is not obviously just the United Nations, it's not just civil society, it's actually women that are convinced that we should wield our power for not the individual's benefit. I mean, of course the individual is going to benefit, but like I said, we're talking about families, we're talking about communities. So according to UNFPA, and you know, my teams all over the world, we're in 150 countries, they've really studied this, 3 zeros are going to have huge impact. Contraception, you've already spoken to, I love the panel that came before. And contraception is not just a medicalized thing. It's your ability to plan your family. When, how many, with whom. For God's sake, no to child marriage, right? Which leads us to our second zero. We're going to zero preventable maternal death. It's not a perfect world. Not every maternal death is preventable. But we know the disparities. Being indigenous, right? In many countries, you're at a disadvantage. The same for women of African descent. And we also know that young people, shall I just not be too diplomatic about it and say, are being lied to every single day. Young girls are being coerced. It's not a marriage. You know, if she's 14, a marriage I thought was about consent and love and mutual respect. The minute you have a 14-year-old being married off, something is very wrong. I work in humanitarian circumstances with my teams. A lot of the maternal deaths that we see are in conflict zones, or even if it's a cyclone or a drought or whatever, the bargaining already starts, right? And the rights of the girl are diminished. So ending maternal mortality is, again, not just a medical issue. Of course, there's a lot of things we can do with mobile health. I'm very excited about tech because that also brings, you know, good procedures to the community level. But the third one, and here I'm appealing to everybody because it's everybody's business, a lot of the heartache, a lot of the sorrow in communities is because of gender-based violence. Women getting beat up, whoever feeling that might makes right. And when are we going to deal with this? So I'm excited when I see men stepping up. This is your issue. I'm excited when I see people defending the rights of people of sexual diversities. This is our issue. But yet and still, right? Days lost at work. And the shame, which for some reason attaches to the victim rather than the perpetrator, that's where we are today. So when I'm looking forward to the next 30 years, and I'm following the lead of young people in everything that I do, you know, like our convening in Benin, where the young people, and it's online, came up with their Cotonou points of action, some of which I'm incorporating in what I'm telling you. Young people are going to change that dynamic. We're not going to have it normal for femicide to happen as frequently as it does. And online violence is also going to be interrupted. Trying to shame and, you know, naked picture women and all this stuff. This is a governance issue. So my last point with this action, contraception, ending maternal mortality, you know, and child marriage and FGM and everything else, and also working on sexual and gender-based violence, we do have the data. We do have the evidence. We do need to persuade parliamentarians and lawmakers to collect that data and evidence in a respectful, anonymous way so we can track how well we're doing.
You laid that out incredibly well. And I'd like to build on something that you just said, in that evidence is important to demonstrate and show when people are being lied to. And I appreciate your candor about that. And we know that this is an issue, SRHR is an issue that has become highly politicized and radioactive in some circles, that is not productive and is a distraction, and in some cases can undermine security of women and their families and a threat to their rights going forward. And so in the environment that we're living in, how can we combat that?
Well, we can certainly make sure that women's voices are heard loud and clear. No one should be squelched, but certainly I think the silencing of women, seen and not heard, teaching our daughters to be patient, to be second, third, fourth, fifth in line. Right now, the epidemic of hunger means that women go without because, of course, they prioritize others, shall we say. For me, I think one thing that's really important is to have the younger and the older people in general, but now I'm speaking of women in particular, exchange views. Much as I've talked about menstruation, I think it's so important to talk about menopause, and that's coming a little bit more into play because it's a life cycle issue. And I think there's wisdom in older people and there's wisdom in younger people as well. So that dyad of bringing these discussions to light, no longer, like in East Africa, they say hiding behind the curtain. No, we need to talk about these issues openly. And while I actually think that power concedes nothing without a demand, this was Frederick Douglass during the pre-civil rights era, it was abolition in that case. I also think that we're much better at making the case now. And a lot of people have been persuaded who really didn't know much about, they didn't know the consequences. So when we actually build those bridges, so, like you're doing, we're having a conversation, not everybody here may be a health expert or whatever, but everybody has their own life. They have their family, they have people that have cared for them. And that's what I think the multilateral system, the United Nations, our Secretary General, when he appeals for peace, which he does on a literal daily basis, the whole point is let us solve these human problems together. Created by humans, solvable by humans.
You raised so many important points about intergenerational wisdom and understanding each other. And I think what was mentioned previously as well by you and others who have been part of the forum today is leadership, and everyone has a role to play, whether you're 10 years old, 20 years old, 50, 70 years old, and what we've learned and how that can be leveraged. And also from the previous discussion, to be brave. These are not easy challenges, and they're important with cascading impacts directly and indirectly. And so in our last moment, kind of a theme of closing out conversations is your call to action. What would you ask everyone in the audience and those here to do?
What would I like you to do? I would like you to step out confidently with hope and with determination. Women have fashioned this world in better ways since time immemorial. We're talking about where there's a will, there's a way. That's political leadership, and you should lead wherever you are. If you're a cashier at the grocery store, conduct yourself in a way that's welcoming to someone who may seem, poor or not well dressed or whatever, but there's a solidarity there. That's part of our action that we can take in small ways that aggregates. We talked about sustainable financing throughout this day. Put your money where your mouth is, absolutely, but look for innovative ways of doing that. Money doesn't necessarily solve everything, but we do need resources in order to conquer some of these issues. And my last point is full circle, Allison, to where you started us off. Either we're going to quake in the corner in fear, or we're going to speak to each other in a type of a dialogue. And, one size doesn't fit all, but we have to be able to have that attitude of genuine problem solving, which to me means dialogue. And ultimately, it does mean world peace. We shouldn't let people fool themselves that peace is out of reach. Women actually build the peace. And I expect each of us to take actions that are actually going to lead to the conditions where our 10-year-old girl in her village is herself going to be able to step out in hope and determination.
Very well said. Thank you.
So much. Thanks, Irene. Thank you.
Now, please welcome to the stage Foreign Policy's Diana Marrero.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Natalia. It's always good to hear your insights and the passion that you bring to your work. So we're going to wrap up this formal set of programming and encourage you all to grab a drink very quickly because we have a really cool film that we want to show and a very short segment outside during the networking session. So I invite you all to join us outside. But before we wrap up here, I just wanted to take a moment again to thank our partners for the program, the Bridge Commission, the One Site Essilor Lexatica Foundation, MasterCard, the Population Institute, the Club de Madrid, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And if you're still in New York on the morning of Thursday the 26th, in 2 days, please feel free to join us back here at the MasterCard Tech Hub for an event on sustainable digital transformation. You can scan the QR code, I believe it's on the screen, to get the agenda and to register. And also be sure to join FP at UNGA79 for our programming taking place at FP's Hub at the Rockefeller Center. We'll have programming on tech and health tomorrow, energy and food on Thursday, and we will be ending both nights with cocktail receptions and networking. We're hosting 2 different podcast tapings, live tapings from our award-winning podcast team. So really encourage you all to check out our programming at foreignpolicy.com/events. And so now, please, I just encourage you to join us outside for a cocktail reception and film screening.